take a moment to say, good job. There have been a lot of concepts thrown at you so far, but as you'll see, all of these ideas will fit into place when we put them into practice in the step-by-step process in Unit 3. We're almost there. Stick with it. Okay, on to Module 5. Last unit we learned about the building blocks of level design, the elements that you need to plan for as you're designing and building your gameplay spaces. Encounters, narrative elements, vistas, and audio elements. Now we're going to learn about the physical construction of your level designs. We will need to account for these 5 things when we are designing our levels: play spaces, flow, timing, landmarks, and boundaries. As we learned last module, encounters are the basic building blocks of gameplay. They are what the level designer creates, and they're the majority of the content that the player consumes. Encounters occur in play spaces, areas built to constrain the action and present it to the player. We're going to step through an encounter play space and discuss the component parts in the order that a player might experience them. As a general rule, it's useful to think about your encounters in stages. As the player approaches an encounter, they would normally move through the following stages of awareness of the content. Number 1, context. 2, concept. 3, presentation. 4, enemy spawn positions. 5, cover. 6, other elements. And 7, the exit. We're going to go through them one by one. Unless your level is entirely abstract, some kind of logical continuity to your spaces will help them feel more immersive to the player. So it's a good rule of thumb to always keep the context of the level in mind as you're laying out your encounters. That means that if your game is set in Dallas, Texas, players will expect to find buildings, streets, or neighborhoods that look like Dallas, Texas. Likewise, if your game is set on a post-apocalyptic world conquered by mad cows, players will expect to see, well, honestly, I'm not sure what they would expect to see. Maybe something like the picture on the right. Let's return to our theoretical game setting and look at a play space there. While the example setting here uses a simple art style, it's still built around a mood theme, intended to look plausible from the player's eye view. We know that our example game is set in a forest-type world, and our example level is set along a meandering forest path. We can use that context to help us think about possible play spaces to build the encounters around. Since it's a forest with a road through it, the player might reasonably expect to see things like fallen logs, riverbanks, bridges over ravines, rock slides, caves, etc. A gigantic boat sitting in the middle of the forest probably wouldn't make that much sense in context, so we're leaving that off the list. Not that you couldn't do a boat in a forest. You'd probably just want to establish some sort of context for the player that explains why it's there, and finding it might make some sense. Like the concept for our overall level, encounters can benefit from a concept as well. Sometimes the concept is highly creative, but as we've learned, it's also common for games to simply include meat and potatoes encounters, opportunities for the player to engage with the game mechanics and have some fun. On the left in this image, you'll see spaces that are representative of Dallas, Texas. On the right, these might be images that are representative of our mad cow planet. Maybe. I'm not going for anything fancy in our example encounters. These are just meat and potatoes play spaces along a forest road. Just a few places to battle enemies and to spot and find a power-up. The game mechanics in this example are colored red. Encounters should never come as a surprise to the player. Presentation will vary depending on the kind of game you're making, but generally it's a good rule of thumb that encounters be presented so that the player has some time to assess the situation and then voluntarily engage with the gameplay. In this top-down view of our example space, the starting point is marked by the red arrow in the lower right-hand corner. This image shows the player view of the space from that same location. I put the starting point in an elevated position and back far enough so that the player could examine the play space in front of them in relative safety. Notice that because the player is higher up than the encounter, entering the play space, in this case moving forward and then down over the edge of the starting rock that you're standing on, would feel like a conscious and deliberate act. I included the tall rock on the left-hand side of this example presentation to help give the player a feeling of security. Standing next to a wall or other cover piece like this can help to create a sense of safety. Finally, notice that we can see the enemy from our starting point. The enemy might be stationary, or it might be moving around, perhaps pacing back and forth or patrolling the area. But either way, the player's brain will immediately register, I see a bad guy. There's an encounter ahead. As we push forward on the creation of our play space, remember that it's important to understand the mechanics of your game, core mechanics and game mechanics. Remember that, for the purposes of this discussion, our example game is a first-person shooter. That means that the player will have to move through the space and their camera, character, and controls will come into play almost continually. Since the player is in control of their own camera and character, this play space is laid out deliberately so that the important things that the player needs to see are basically laid out in front of them as they are approaching this gameplay setup. The player can move forward into the area and keep a steady view on the action, in this case the bad guy, without too much effort in managing the camera. If parts of the same encounter were set up so as to require the player to change the camera view a lot, for example, if enemies were placed on a higher or lower plane than the player's plane of view, or if bad guys were placed off camera to the left or to the right, then this encounter would become a lot more complex and difficult. Let's say, for the sake of example, that our bad guy is a weak enemy. A few shots from the player's weapon will remove him as a threat, and he can't attack at range. He needs to physically approach the player and attack in melee combat to do damage. Based on our population strategy, we'd need to know if we're at a point in the game where encounters should be easy, moderate, or hard. If we're using the author strategy, then the difficulty of this setup would be up to us as the designer. But those details would tell us a lot about the design for this space. For example, if there were only 2 enemies, as pictured, then this encounter might not really be that much of a challenge for a player. But that might be precisely what we want from this encounter, especially if it happens early in the game. But suppose we wanted this same encounter space to be more challenging. Say we wanted the player to feel some pressure during the battle, but we didn't necessarily want to make them feel overwhelmed. We could introduce more bad guys. Even enemies that are easy to beat can become threatening if there are enough of them rushing at you all at the same time. But a big knot of bad guys rushing in probably wouldn't be the best use of this space. First, if the player misses a few shots, then they might find themselves quickly overwhelmed. And second, after the battle is over, there's a lot more physical area in the level for the player to move through, and not much else to do. A common level design technique is to gradually introduce more bad guys as the battle continues. This is usually accomplished by spawning more enemies under specific conditions. For example, maybe we could introduce more bad guys after a set number of the first group are defeated. Or, if we wanted to make the encounter more perilous, we could have the reinforcements spawn after a set amount of time had elapsed. That would have the effect of rewarding a skillful player, because they might be able to eliminate the starter set of bad guys before the second wave spawned and moved into the attack. But if the player struggled with taking out the first set, then the arrival of more might make the difficulty of the encounter suddenly spike into a very serious threat. Another technique for adjusting the difficulty of this encounter would be to increase the amount of cover in the space. Notice that I've added a few more large rocks to the area. If there's a lot of cover in between the player and the bad guys, then the difficulty of this encounter goes up quite a bit. With a simple change like this, it becomes a lot more difficult for the player to target the bad guys as they approach, because they're shielded by the rocks. The player might suddenly be set upon at close range with very little time to intercept the incoming enemies. Beyond the bad guys, our level could include other elements that are part of our design. For example, if power-ups were one of our game mechanics, we could hide one in the trees that form part of the boundaries for the level. This second play space is especially interesting because it requires the player to move away from the main flow path of the level. The exit from our level can also use some thought. If the player has to search for where they're supposed to go next, or they can't figure out what they need to do to move on to the next encounter, they can get confused or frustrated. The exit is also an opportunity to foreshadow what's coming up next, or later on in the level. There's a natural exit for our example level just beyond the last play space. I didn't add more art to the level beyond this last setup, but this would be a great area to preview upcoming encounters or to add in some interesting visual details. Every type of game has a set of best practices for designing its encounter spaces. In our example space, the fact that the encounters are arranged in front of the player and on a single plane makes them less difficult, as does the sparsity of cover for the bad guys. But as we saw, the space could be easily adapted to become more challenging, even without adding in more bad guys, simply by changing a few physical details, adding more rocks, or changing the plane that the enemies were introduced on. These are examples of first-person shooter level design techniques, but every game is different, and figuring out those types of techniques for the game that you are making will help you grow as a designer. Just as we did in this example, work through the experience of playing your encounters step by step, factoring in the core mechanics and the game mechanics. That will help you identify those best practices for yourself. Now let's move on to some other types of physical details used in level construction. Flow is a term that I use to describe the overall movement of players through a level. A great level design encourages players to move through the space in a natural way. They don't need to struggle to find their way around, and it's not hard to determine what is important in the level and what is not. Great flow is hard to achieve, especially now in the era of hyper-realistic graphics. Game engines can draw huge spaces with astonishing levels of detail, so much that players can easily get overwhelmed or lost in the density and confusion of those spaces. I find that the strongest way to create good level flow is to think about the level as a simple directional diagram. Let's look at some examples of levels with great level flow. Remember that we discussed the classic Unreal multiplayer level Facing Worlds in Module 2 as an example of a level with a structural theme. Structural themes lend themselves to creating terrific level flow. Its flow pattern could best be described as a straight line. There's very little side-to-side deviation necessary to move through the level, and the focus of the action remains directly in front of the massive base towers on the map. This creates a very high level of focus in that area. So high, in fact, that it requires teams to cooperate to accomplish even the simplest of goals. Teams that start off in Facing Worlds quickly discover that they're not going to be able to push across the open bridge without sniping support from their own team high up in the tower behind them. We also talked about a few Halo levels that I designed, including Blood Gulch. Blood Gulch is a figure 8 flow pattern. Both bases lie at opposite ends of a pinched box canyon connecting by a circling trail. The narrowing of the canyon walls helps to constrain the focus and movement of the players from both sides of the map, directing them towards the bases at either end. One interesting wrinkle that I tried to include in Blood Gulch was the idea of secondary flow paths built into the sides of the map. One is interior and goes down through a series of caves, and the other is exposed to the open air and climbs up over a ridge that overlooks the central pinch point. My goal with the side paths was to give players the opportunity to circumvent the strong central flow path, as well as to include strong incentives for them to use those paths by placing power-ups and sniping spots. But both side paths still feed back into the central figure 8 flow pattern of the overall level, helping to ensure that players that choose the side routes are still brought back into the main focus of the action. Single-player flow is a tricky thing. I've spent a lot of hours watching players lost in my own levels, even when I thought the way forward was perfectly clear. There are two fundamental things that level designers can try to do to make sure that their single-player levels have a strong flow. One, as we discussed, make sure that you're accounting for context. Think about where your encounters occur and try to make sure that they make some sense in terms of how they're constructed. And two, think about the transitions from one encounter to the next. The spaces leading up to an encounter or leading away from it are opportunities to give the player important cues that can help them understand how to move through the game space. We'll learn more about those visual cues as we discuss landmarks later on in this module. A man walks into a bar, orders a drink, and has a seat. While he's waiting, he spots a pirate sitting in a corner booth. He looks closer and realizes that the pirate has 2 wooden arms and 2 wooden legs. Naturally curious, he walks over and says, I hope you don't mind, but I couldn't help but noticing that you have 2 wooden arms and 2 wooden legs. Were you involved in some fierce sea battles? The pirate looks up sadly and says, no, me father was a tree. Hardy, hardy, har, har! timing is crucial to great level design. Players are highly sensitive to getting bored or frustrated. To combat this, designers should constantly be measuring how long it takes to get to the interest points in their level. They also need to develop the skill of mentally modeling how long it takes players to complete whatever challenges are set for them in the play space. In our mock-up encounters, there are lots of things that we could measure to get good timing. For example, we could measure time to contact with the enemy. We could measure how long it takes players to complete the encounters in the level. This can be useful because, as we have learned, level content is the most resource-intensive content to produce. If players are blowing through our setups too quickly, we are not getting the best value out of our investment of resources. It's useful to know the timing to the major points of interest in a level. This can help the level designer build an understanding of what makes for a satisfying rhythm to their encounters. In our example space, it would be useful to know how long it takes players to travel from the first encounter to find the power-up in the second setup, and finally how long it takes for them to reach the final battle. I would repeatedly scale the level geometry in my levels to make sure that the timing of moving through the spaces felt good and helped reinforce my design intentions. In the example space here, it would be interesting to play with the distances between the setups to see if a lull in the action felt good for the player or if it made the level feel boring or flat. I used to think I was the only designer to do this until I read a quote from the designer of CS Dust, Dave Johnston, who said the same thing. The entire quote is included here, but I was particularly struck by the fact that Johnston said that as he was balancing the level, he would continually play with the timing of the starting positions on the map to ensure that both teams would arrive at the major choke points at the same time. It's a general principle in game design that important information should be communicated to the player in as many redundant ways as possible. For example, if you're trying to get the player's attention, they might not notice a small graphical flash on their screen, but the chances of them noticing the message go up if you add an accompanying buzzing sound effect and a simultaneous vibration of the game controller in their hands. Landmarks are a way of communicating and reinforcing important information to the player. Let's take a look. A weenie is a large vertical element in the design of a space. Weenies rise up over the normal sight lines of the environment and serve as markers for key locations in the level. The term weenie was originally coined by Disney Imagineers, and it was used to describe parts of their theme parks that stood up tall and thin, like hot dogs thrust up into the sky, so that visitors to the park could see them at a distance. Here are a few examples: Big Thunder Mountain, Space Mountain, the Matterhorn, and Sleeping Beauty's castle. Each of these weenies are iconic silhouettes, and they help identify areas in the park from far away. Because game levels are virtual geometry, level designers can be endlessly creative when choosing elements to help players orient themselves. As you can see, there are an awful lot of game weenies that take a variety of different shapes. Let's take a look at our example village scene again. The red arrow at the bottom of our diagram shows our entry presentation. Now notice the tall tower circled on the diagram. Here's the player's view from the starting presentation. Notice that the tall tower, included here in red, peeks up over the boundary that surrounds the space. The tall tower serves as a point of interest for the player and is also a potential destination to explore. It makes a perfect weenie in our village. But there's also that large black shape on the right. We will talk about that next. Global landmarks are elements in the visual design of game spaces that are present throughout several levels in a game. They help to ground the player in the level spaces and create a feeling of a unified world. The Halo space ring itself was a global landmark in the first Halo game. It served as an ideal point of visual orientation throughout all of the levels in Halo single player. Lots of games use massive landmarks of one form or another to create a sense of continuity in their levels and in their game world. Pictured here is the Hydra giant monster from the Resistance series of games and the Reaver sentient robots from the Mass Effect franchise. Both of these elements appeared in multiple levels in the game and created a feeling for the player that the game world was alive and under attack by terrifying hostile forces. Remember that black weenie that we saw peeking up over the edge at the beginning of the module? The backdrop of the massive mountain could serve as a global landmark in our example scenes. Here's another shot of the massive black mountain used as a global landmark in our example gameplay space. The mountain would be a great dramatic global detail for all of the play spaces in our forest path level, culminating with the player's arrival at the base of the mountain itself. Let's move from the very big to the very small. Local decoration is another common type of landmark that appears in game levels. Local decorations appear in particular parts of the level to help visually differentiate that area from anywhere else. Here's an example from the classic PC multiplayer shooter Team Fortress 2 in the multiplayer map Two Forts. Notice that in the two images, the exterior area of the fort on the left is characterized by rough-hewn decor and faded colors. But inside of the fort in the map room, which is the objective area of the Versus game type, the local decor switches to a high-tech, futuristic appearance, complete with exposed wires and computers. These decorations help the player understand exactly where they are in the level. Let's talk through an example. Let's pretend we were making a level in a junkyard setting. The images here in our slide show a number of interesting visual details that we could use to populate play spaces in our junkyard level. So there could be an encounter in the bus section, or one set in the Anchor graveyard, or perhaps a battle set atop the mountain of tires. Visual details like these help to preserve the overall concept of a junkyard setting while also giving each of the encounters in the level its own unique visual flair and individual identity. The three encounter areas in our example village are all differentiated by their own form of local decoration. The first encounter area in the village is characterized by the small huts and the village obelisk. Players in this part of the village would see the centrally placed obelisk, and it would help them to know where they are. The second encounter area is visually characterized by the large huts. I deliberately place them only in the center area of the level, making them its local decor. Finally, the third area in the village is identified by the Weenie Tower. Judicious use of these decorations makes the different areas of the village look and feel distinct, but still feel like parts of a coherent whole. The surrounding decorations can also be used to give environmental cues to help players navigate through game levels. Environmental cues can be as dramatic as the differences between the red and blue decorations on opposite sides of the map in Team Fortress 2. The map room in the red headquarters is colored red. The map room in the blue headquarters is colored blue. Or they could be as subtle as the graffiti tags used all over in Counter-Strike levels to indicate important landmarks or even basic directions in the level. Look at that. Spray paint details pointing out the direction to base A or B. The dirt paths in the open air level Blood Gulch serve a similar purpose. They help to orient the player in the space and guide them towards the action or towards interesting features in the level. Notice the brightest part of those paths draw your eye against the backdrop. You immediately know where it is that I want you to go. Even our example levels have environmental cues built into them. In this case, really just one cue, which is the brown path that winds through the spaces. The path, the roadway, gives a subtle but consistent frame of reference that can help the player to orient themselves in the space. Without that simple environmental cue, it would be easy for players to lose their bearing and get lost and frustrated. Boundaries form the limits of your level. They constrain your play spaces and keep the action where you want it to be. Boundaries might seem like an obvious problem with an obvious solution, but there can be a few tricks to making them work well. The worst kind of game boundaries are invisible walls. Spaces in a level where you simply can't go, even though it looks like you should be able to go there. They're bad because the player has no way to anticipate them and no way to navigate near them without the old bump and grind method. The Lord of the Rings series of games from Electronic Arts were filled with cases like this. They had a number of levels where it looked like you could travel wherever you wanted, but invisible boundaries kept you locked into the action. The screenshot on the right is from the PlayStation 2 action game Shinobi. This scene suffers from a slightly different issue. Boundaries must be clear. It's important that they not be visually confusing. If a player has to wonder if they can get past a boundary, that's a problem. In the pictured scene, the walls are clear boundaries, but I can't tell if the player is supposed to be able to get past the big egg-shaped thing or not. Depending on where your level falls on the spectrum of level themes, it's generally best if barriers are visually grounded in the space. If the level barriers look like an appropriate boundary and they fit into the context of the level, that's ideal. Pictured here are an assortment of physical boundaries from various Halo levels. You notice the encircling water, the high canyon walls, and the prominent rock bluffs clearly look impassable, and they all fit perfectly into the landscape of their scenes. They fit into the context. In our example levels, I'm using a two-tiered boundary edge. The inner perimeter of the boundary are the tree lines. These would be somewhat permeable so that the player could wander into these areas and explore them to discover hidden secrets and power-ups. The outer edge of the boundary are the large rock walls, which would be completely impassable. The benefit of using a two-tiered system like that is that the inner boundary, the trees, becomes a signal to the player that they are approaching an impassable area. As you can see from this player's perspective view of the space, the trees also help to break up the unrelieved silhouette of the rock walls, making the space look and feel more natural and immersive from the eye level of the player. Games that feature single-screen encounters can still have boundary issues. The mega-hit title Where's My Water is a perfect example. The game features a fun mechanic of digging through dirt to form a course for water to flow through, with the goal of bringing it to the nozzle to help the main character of the game have a shower. Many of the levels in the game were restricted to just one screen, and the purple stone boundaries made the unplayable portions of the map quite clear. But when the designers tried to make levels that stretched off-screen, requiring the player to dig down to a second screen below, the fact that the bottom edge of the screen wasn't a hard boundary was very confusing to some players. In this module, we learned about the physical elements that a level designer uses as they are constructing their encounters. We covered the following topics: play spaces, flow, timing, landmarks, and boundaries. This was a very long module. I hope you learned a lot. Our next module is the last one of this unit. In it, we will learn how surprises can spice up our level designs. See you there.